Shalom, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Shema Podcast. So today is a pretty exciting one, and probably one which people really want to get to, and that is the Mosaic Law and its commandments. Today we're going to be taking a corrective look at the Law of Moses, the Torah, and its manifold commandments, their meanings, and while really we're going to be attempting to not only correct the prevalent misunderstandings in modern-day Christian thought over the law, but expanding on the law's actual true meaning, its true intentions, and what it actually is. So for this, we're going to actually be splitting this episode to 2 parts. Next, we'll really get into the commandments per se, and in this, we're really kind of getting into the introductory material, trying to approach the law first. So it goes without saying that the law is deeply misunderstood, and at almost every stage and every angle of it. In the modern world, or the modern Christian world at least, the Law of Moses is this old, antiquated, and almost irrelevant system of legal material given to Israel on Mount Sinai. It's the placeholder for their salvation prior to Christ. Keep the law perfectly and you'll be saved, basically. And we've since gone over this idea in episode 3, where we looked at the salvation economy of pre-Calvary Israel. But here we're going to attempt to reorient ourselves towards the biblical law itself and try to extinguish these prevailing ideas, showing that this type of mindset is not only a larger theological and soteriological fallacy, that is, to view the law in these ways, but it's also just fundamentally incorrect with the law. Just looking at the law, this isn't what it takes to form as. And this topic, the law, it's been addressed in numerous ways by numerous people, and especially in the Messianic pronomian world. The scholarly literature is expansive, but here we're going to try to take our own little approach to it, and we want to primarily do a few things. One of them is we want to correct the ideas of a threefold categorization of the law into the popular idea of ceremonial, civil, and moral. We also want to, and kind of simultaneously, get away from the enumeration of the law into 613 commandments, or mitzvot. And we also want to get away from the law being in any way this rigid legalistic code, or that it served merely as boundary markers between Israel and her surrounding nations. And these are a host of numerous different ideas you often find in discussions and writings surrounding the topic. And in this episode, or these episodes, we'll just take a different approach to it. And I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be really good for people. And for people of whatever background or conviction you come from, whatever denomination, or whatever approach to the law you have, I think this will help reorient ourselves towards the Mosaic Law. So the first place for us to naturally start is the Hebrew word for law itself, and this is Torah. So the idea of Torah, meaning law, that is a codified set of statutes, it mostly derives from later ideas. And the concept as we know it of law comes from the Latin word lex. And one could say it's actually hard to conceive of the Israelites actually understanding the Torah as law in a judicial or a legalist, so not legalist, but legalistic, but just legal sense, or any of the ancient Near Eastern people. And there is more of common law, a combination of customs and ideas that were largely circumstantial. So the ancient mind would probably not see the law as we do, and we can be pretty sure that they wouldn't. And this idea has been written on extensively, with many different theses being presented by many different scholars and authors. For those who are interested, the 3 most popular and best, in my opinion at least, are probably Anne Fitzpatrick McKinley's The Transformation of Torah from Scribal Advice to Law. Then you also have Bernard Jackson's Studies in the Semiotics of Biblical Law, and I'll probably pronounce his name wrong, but Michael Lefebvre's Collections, Codes, and Torah. And all 3 of these books, which were published in pretty close proximity to one another, they outline different ideas, so they're not the same with what they say, but they outline different ideas of how the law was understood in ancient Israel, and how it developed from primarily the idea of scribal and religious code, and then into a more formalized system of law proper that we have. And essentially, at its earliest stages, the law really could be seen as something more akin to religious wisdom literature and presenting Israel essentially with how to live, advice, codes, and morality rather than anything that is seen as legislative. And others, obviously have written on this and also in shorter formats. A really good example is John C. Collins' 2012 article. That's in the Journal for the Study of Judaism. And it's titled The Transformation of Torah and Second Temple Judaism. And while there's some disagreeable elements in Collins' article, and he does mostly focus on the Second Temple period Judaism, he does show how the ideas of ancestral laws and customs provide this really neat domain from which we can start to conceptualize and understand later Jewish ideas, which do not, however, necessarily or perfectly reflect their original conception. So we're going to have Second Temple period thoughts that are not necessarily the same as the ancient Israelites, but it's a better domain from which to begin rather than after that period. So, rather than law, the Hebrew Torah is best understood as instruction, guidance, or the general concept of a way. And the word comes from the root verb yara, which means to shoot or to guide, and figuratively or literally to shoot an arrow and presumably hit its mark. And while some attempt to draw a parallel between this and the meaning of missing the mark in the Hebrew word for sin, chata or het, there are some issues there, and sometimes it's pressed a little too far. But nevertheless, the primary meaning of the Hebrew Torah is this idea of instruction or guidance. And we find this all throughout, where it's being used, in a sense, apart from God's Torah to Israel specifically. And examples in Proverbs 4:2. In the Hebrew, we're going to read, Ke leka tov natati lakem torati al ta'azabu. And we could translate this, for I give you good teaching, do not forsake my Torah, my instruction. And I've seen this verse used a lot, especially amongst Messianics, to mean God's law. But it's actually speaking from the perspective of a father to his son, which for us it further clarifies the meaning of Torah as instruction, since it's synonymous, or parallel at least here, with lekah, which should be understood as learning or teaching. And in fact, in verse 1, it's specifically the father's musar, his instruction or warning that is in view. Later in 6:20, we'll reread, if not forsaking a mother's Torah. So the word only means law in the strictest sense if it is used in that way. At its basal meaning, the base of the lexeme, the word, it firstly means instruction, and then it begins to mean other things as it is, and if it is used in other ways. And some will go and they will suggest that the Hebrew Torah indeed meant law in the legal sense when it was at least translated into Septuagint with the Greek nomos. But this is problematic for a few reasons. First, nomos itself hardly ever means law, and there is a significant amount of research, which I could probably include my own in that, on the Greek nomos not meaning law, and really failing on to take on that type of concept in its use, at least as we expect it. Instead, it's basically been, I would almost unequivocally proven that the closest meaning to law that nomos has is formal or informal custom. But really it has this larger and generic idea of a principle, way, what has come to be accepted as custom, etc. And Lord willing, I'll actually be publishing on this in more extent. But the idea of nomos clarifying a legalistic understanding in Second Temple period Judaism of the Hebrew idea of it is just incorrectly asserted by many people. And it's it's hardly tenable, really, taking all the data into consideration. If we are to see some type of systemization of Torah, it would be more of ancestral custom and the religious way of living contained in the Torah's writings and expressed in different ways by different authors throughout different stages in history. And this also requires us to point out that rabbinic ideas codified in the Mishnah and Talmuds, it's not to be seen as the same with Second Temple period or ancient ideas. Put simply, we're really dealing with a convoluted idea of a combination and development of ideas. We don't have this clear, cut and dried legalistic idea that's oftentimes presented by so many. And being able to undo this type of understanding and uncovering a more accurate understanding, it requires us to kind of circle around the Torah and look at it from different angles, which for the most part are provided a distorted image of. But for now, what we can see is that semantically or lexically, basically what the word Torah means itself is almost unassailably guidance or instruction. And some have even attempted to demonstrate, and convincingly so for many, that Torah ought to be understood as a metaphor in a type of figurative sense, and as journey for one person who argues that. And therefore, when we sever this meaning, this metaphorical meaning in translation endeavors, it unduly and inevitably removes the concept from its original domain, and we start to force Torah into something that never really belonged to. Making it mean law just doesn't fit semantically, but most importantly, it doesn't fit according to the literary and cultural environment in which it was written. So, also, beyond instruction, how Torah and Nomos are used in both the First and Second Testaments is rather important, as in the Second, it's really going to differ. We do have these ideas that have developed that the New Testament's interacting with, and it's going to be able to have more meaning to draw from, if we could, more ideas, kind of like what we talked about with faith having something to attach itself to as a noun now that Christ had come. So, but we've already shown that with respect to general instruction, even in parental instruction, we have this in the First Testament. And nomos is going to kind of take on this meaning as well. But it does take on other meanings, which invite a little bit of different things, a little different assortment of ideas, but still don't agree with the idea of a legalistic system. So, as many are probably familiar with, while the Torah refers to the collection of commandments, these 613 laws, it also refers to the first 5 books, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this is important, especially for some zealous Christians out there, that when you say to a Jew that they aren't saved from the law, to them, you are essentially saying that they aren't saved from the first 5 books. And that's quite a bit of a pickle there. And I've given that piece of advice to many that, to the modern Jew, it sounds like you're saying what is the equivalent to a Christian hearing that one isn't saved from what is contained within the 4 Gospels and Acts. So the word Torah has taken on a meaning that is more than just the sum of its parts, or a specific referent of the word, but a lot of times it has the whole of the message contained within it in mind. And we see this in the Second Testament often, such as in cases where we read the law and the prophets, which even on the surface seems to be referring to two different corpuses within the biblical canon. And now we have questions of, well, did people think there was a canon back then? Was there a canon? And there are at least ideas of a biblical canon prior to the Second Testament, even if it hadn't been formally put together, scriptures canonized, or what have you. And last episode, we interacted with a scholar named Levi S. Baker, and he has put forward this idea of there really being a canon consciousness in the time, which is pretty accurate. It's pretty good. But what we see is that the law, Torah, or in the Greek, onomos or onomu, we get it, that this term is used to describe the whole or parts of the First Testament and not just the first 5 books or the prophets. It also describes this body of teaching and content, such as when Jesus says that the law and the prophets prophesied until John the Immerser, and here this is in Matthew 11:13. And this leads, and we won't get into, but it leads into seeing the law as having more of an effect or a function than just being a law, this codified system. And this has been extrapolated by a lot of scholars, in some ways well. For example, Brian Rosner and Paul in the Law, he sees one of the functions of the law being prophecy. But a lot of these scholars, including Rosner, they failed to strike a chord of balance with these multiply applications and such. And the main problem is that they tend to, or they attempt to, perhaps, circumvent the rather holistic and structural nature of the law's commandments. And they uphold, and everyone listening is familiar with this, whether you believe this or you've heard it said. We have 3 views that we're going to try to get rid of here. The first is the conflation of the law with the Mosaic covenant. So that's saying that the law is the Mosaic covenant itself. Second is the law's commandments as primarily legal injunctions, and then again the law's commandments as boundary markers, which are derived from other ancient Near Eastern codes and legal systems. And we'll get to that soon. But for now, we want to reiterate how the law is used in the Second Testament as a concept, and how it does not take the resemblance of some type of codified list or system of statutes. And the law and the prophets is a good place to see that there's at least the law and then the prophets section. And we also hear the law, the prophets, the Psalms. But Jesus in John 10:34, he even says, "Is it not written in your law?" And here he's referring to Psalm 82. 2 chapters later, we read of the crowd saying that they heard out of the law that the Christ, the Mashiach, remains forever. Now, while this could be referring to the Torah, the first 5 books, it's a bit difficult to imagine that they aren't referring to the prophets, or at least a teaching from the prophets. But we can't really know, as we don't know where this passage is or what the reference is to. But Jesus also, he refers to either Psalm 35 or 69 in John 15:25 when he quotes, "They hated me without cause," and he considers this the law. Paul too, the apostle, he quotes an unknown passage about woman being silent in 1 Corinthians 14:34. He says the law says this, and then he also references the story of Abraham's sons Isaac and Ishmael in Genesis. He calls this the law in Galatians 4:21. In 1 Corinthians 14:21, Paul quotes Isaiah 28:11, calling it the law. So when we look at how the law is used, just as a word, rather than, again, a system of laws, of commands, we have a Genesis narrative, we have Torah proper, Isaiah, and Psalms. And these all count as law. And we could just assume that the rest of the First Testament would be subsumed under this categorical description of law, meaning scripture, in a sense. And this is all important because it's a clear way of seeing that the law is more than just its, or at least at all specifically, its commandments. It stands as a useful term for denoting the whole of the scriptures. And while, again, we won't get into this, this does give weight to seeing the law as a salvation historical era, as an agent of salvation, this placeholder, which we kind of discussed in episode 3. And then, when Paul speaks of the law versus faith, for instance, it isn't necessarily correct to see him as juxtaposing the commandments and faith. In reality, we have this bigger idea of the law being a synecdoche for the covenantal system. But by even mentioning this, we're getting ahead of ourselves. And we'll probably cover this in a future episode, and I have covered it to some extent, NCNU, the law being used in this sense. And we can at least make the case that it is used. But nevertheless, what we are faced with is having to understand the difference between the law's commandments and the law is either the biblical corpus, an era, system, agent, etc., etc. And Paul's really involved in covenantal discussions, so understanding him and understanding how he can use the law in place or simultaneously being used as covenant is very important. And it allows us to move beyond just the mere commandments idea. So this idea of the law being the covenant itself, the Mosaic covenant, is one of the things that we're gonna try to get away from. One aspect of this that's important is viewing the Torah's pre-Sinai origins. And this is pretty hard to pinpoint, and it's a difficult case that we find a lot of Messianic thinkers trying to make. For example, they appeal to the Sabbath being a creation ordinance in Genesis, the seventh day. They see the patriarchs and others making sacrifices, let alone Melchizedek being a priest. And they often bring up that the law is mentioned prior to Sinai, mostly in two places, Exodus 12 and particularly in Genesis 26:5. And here we read that Abraham, had obeyed God's voice and kept his charge, his commandments, statutes, and finally, his laws. So we need to take a look at this really quick because it is important. So in the verse, we read that Abraham obeyed God's voice, and then in the Hebrew, Shema Abraham Bekoli. And then we read that he kept Ve'yishmor, his charge, Mishmarti, and his commandments, Mitzote, statutes, Hukote, and finally his laws with Dorote. And here the final word, Torah, it's just a we prefix derivative of Torah. So we would translate this, and my laws. So first, from seeing the general semantic use of Torah, and especially this being in the plural, we don't have to require a pre-Sinai Torah, but just that Abraham followed after God's specific plural instructions. So while the use here of words for commandments and statutes and laws, and even probably the voice and God's charge, these uses are probably programmatic in anticipation of the more formalized Torah. And it definitely sets up this idea that we will land on, that the Torah is another stage in formalized and instruction-based relationship with God, the revealing of eternal rightness via the commands. But this is, generally speaking, just language describing Abraham as being obedient in all ways to God. It's actually it contributes towards this idea of Torah being used as instruction and not law. So it's a good verse to use, just not necessarily suggesting that the law has always existed. Shalom, everyone. I hope you all have been enjoying the Shema Podcast so far. About halfway through this season, we will be having a Q&A, so questions and answers, and we are opening up submissions for questions to be requested that in that episode, which will be outside the normal schedule, we will be going over. If you are interested in submitting a question on hopefully any topic that we've gone over, but really anything in general, you can send it to the Shema Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out on the comments of Spotify or YouTube, or even on our Facebook page. So look forward to receiving your questions, and shalom. Now in Exodus 12, we read the almost infamous passage in verse 49 that there shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns amongst you. It's this verse in particular that has given birth to what is called the one law or one law theology, which is the position that Jew and Gentile alike in Christ are both expected to keep the law. And unambiguously, I affirm this view. And that's one of the purposes of this podcast, to basically help people work through this and understand the law's application, and then to appreciate the floodgates of beauty that are opened when we move past this antinomian impasse that's just superimposed onto the scriptures. So sure, yes, this is true, but it's a bit ironic that this passage is used to that effect, as the context of Exodus 12 is unambiguously about the Passover specifically and exclusively. So the chapter instructs that the sojourner must circumcise to keep the Passover, and here we read Torah ahat yiyeh, There shall be one Torah. And this one Torah, with Torah being singular, it's referring to the command of Passover specifically. And so it both removes a whole theological system and perspective, being able to adequately be derived from the verse, and it simultaneously presents a rather significant difficulty for people claiming a typical view of the law, where it always just means this system. And both sides kind of get this verse wrong, but we can see that the language used of the law is indeed used prior to Sinai, and either refer to concretized commands or general instruction, and presumably of both a cultic, a religious, and of an ethical nature. And other than this handful, or really just two, there really isn't any evidence of a Torah pre-Sinai, despite popular ideas of an eternal Torah. So Torah itself being eternal and from the beginning of the world, and this is more found in rabbinic ideas. But in fact, what we do see is we see that Torah is kind of added to, and to some degree is molded and slightly changed to accommodate a new development, season, etc. And the most glaring example is probably the God-approved building of the temple, whereas there's a whole bunch of instructions specifically for the tabernacle, but God allowed a temple. And as we'll see, God does seem to interact clearly with the ancient Near Eastern world and modifies it. So an eternal Torah, while probably a noble thought, a noble idea, it's really hard to base it off of the scripture. I think a better way to see it is in the instruction mindset that we have, which is confirmed by the scripture itself. We'll confirm it more, and semantically, it's this idea that his instruction is perfect and eternal because it's always been the right way, and he's just showing the right way. So I think that's a better way than insisting on an eternal or pre-Sinai Torah. So Torah proper, what we're going to really think about Torah, doesn't come until Exodus 19. And this is when Israel meets God at Sinai. And even then, the Torah, as we know, is progressively given. It's given in different segments, different forms, that eventually lead to its full realization, its fullness. And this multiple stage reception of God's law also begs that we read with the nuances and themes here, rather than just looking back at it in hindsight and saying, it's just all one thing. The text doesn't give us that liberty, and the text itself actually comes into its form as instruction that is revealed in compounding stages for specific results. And it's really drawing Israel into and acclimating them with God's eternal and perfect instruction. And just to look at the literature quickly, in Exodus we have 3 stages of the law. We have the giving of the 10 words, the 10 commandments, in Exodus 20. Then we have the giving of the covenant code in chapters 21 through 23, or some argue till 22. And then we have the rest of this area, the whole book being about the confirmation of the covenant, the instructions for the priesthood, tabernacle, etc., the golden calf incident, the second mountain voyage, and the construction of the tabernacle, which ends Exodus. Now when we get to Leviticus, all the way until chapter 18, it's concerned with the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrifices. Then we have chapters 11 through 15 going over dietary restrictions and ritual impurity. And then chapters 18 to 27 it's an amalgamation of various types of instructions, weaving in and out of cultic and moral commands. So it too is a bit difficult to see as just law. Numbers it's more of a narrative book, and it weaves in various commandments, and most of them are actually reactionary to Israel's faults or repeating and elaborating on things. And then finally Deuteronomy, which is basically the recapitulation of the law, we actually have what we could call a total relaying of the law in a sermon-like and then a prophecy-like fashion. So what we find in the biblical text, and we will discuss this more soon, It's just totally nothing like what a legal code will look like at all. And most of the Torah is given in narrative texts, and this is a super important point that we will return to, but needs to be made. And when we just take a step back and we look at the whole of the Torah, the Pentateuch, it really looks like this story of the creation and development of God and Israel's relationship, with God as Father forming a nation and then explaining to them how they must relate to Him and providing for them, well, fatherly instruction. So, for the first stage, we have the giving of the Decalogue, the 10 words or the 10 commandments, depending on the amount of imperatives one counts, but we're not going to go there. Retaining the idea of words, though, which is relying on the Hebrew davar rather than mitzvah, is more helpful as God's giving us this word, this standard of living in faith. And the 10 words is the covenant itself, as we'll see, rather than the law being the covenant as a whole. But here this developmental process is important to pay attention to, as we'll note that first the Decalogue is given. And then after we have the covenant code being given, it's almost this complement, this further instruction given alongside the Decalogue. And then finally we have further instruction via the law. But just looking at the text, and quite plainly, we see that the Decalogue's given, then the covenant code, which is put into the so-called Book of the Covenant, and that's in Exodus 24:7. And it's then read out loud to Israel, who affirm their obedience to it. We just have this material as being the agreed upon instruction, and it's this which ratified the covenantal relationship with God. And then, and we'll read from the LEB, Exodus 24:12. God tells Moses, and we'll get to the Hebrew soon, "Come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you the tablets of stone and the law and the commandments that I have written to instruct them." And this is one of those examples where translation really matters. As we can read from the ESV, which is a good translation. It's pretty wonderful, but it's often very theologically translated. Even they do this a little better. They say, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction." So the difference is pretty important, as God has already given Israel as a whole the 10 words. He spoke this directly to them. They affirmed to it, and they pledged obedience to God. And then Moses goes into the thickness, which is probably a good translation. And he gets this further instruction that we call the covenant code. He then goes even closer to God with Aaron, with Aaron's sons, and with the 70 elders in 24:1-2. And it's a little difficult here as verse 3 may suggest that Moses received further instruction, so that as he received all that is recorded in the rest of the Torah. But that seems to cause a lot of issues in some ways. And scholars have really gone back and forth about how many times exactly Moses went up this mountain and just how to read the text. This is kind of one of the things that's given way to documentary hypothesis. An option is that the covenant code actually relays the information that 24:1-2 details the origin of Moses receiving, and this can harmonize the text. So Moses records all the Decalogue in this covenant code, comes down, writes it down, affirms the covenant with Israel. You're basically furthering what Israel's agreeing to, and now he's called back up to get more stuff. More stuff. And the calling back is important, as we have the hint of further instruction being adjoined to this previous instruction, the codified instruction thus far with the Decalogue and the covenant code. So something's being added to this. And we can kill two birds with one stone here. We can see that the law as a whole isn't the covenant itself. It can't be. It's not even temporarily fitting. And two, we can identify what the covenant itself is, which seems to be, thus far, the tablets of stone. And then even three, we could throw a third thing in. We have this progressive nature of the law, and it's being given at progressive stages. So here in 24 verse 12, we do need to read the Hebrew and entertain some possible translations options. So first we read Ale Ele Hahara, which is kind of poetic. And this is come up to me on the mountain. And we have Weye Sham, and remain there, or more accurately, be there. But secondly, we read We'etena leka eth luhot ha'eben. And we're translating this, and I will give you the tablets of stone. So this is where we need to kind of land. But the problem here is what comes after, which is the Wehat Torah, and then we have the Weham Mitzvah Asher Katabti Lehorotam. And we're going to translate that, and the law and the commandments which I've written so that you might teach them. The problem is, and this is kind of where I'm centering on, is if we're to be reading the tablets and the law is one thing, or at least as joined together like very closely to uphold this covenant idea. And one scholar, Brevard Childs, he comments here that the syntax is particularly baffling. And he entertains whether the wa here is, a conjunction or explicative, so either the tablets of stone and, or the tablets that is. But he points out that the Decalogue, it's never called the law of commandments, or is it called the teaching and commandment. And we would therefore, if we're going to uphold this idea, we'd seem to be needing an additional preposition, as he argues. And ultimately, he sees the wa before Hat Torah as copulative. And he comments here, we'll read, that the verse seems to imply that Moses obtains not only the tablets of stone, which have been written by God, but also further instruction by which to guide the people. This latter purpose would clarify the need for a period of 40 days on the mountain, end quote. So what's my argument here? My argument is that the verse depicts Moses going up the mountain to receive the Decalogue, which is the covenant, and that he is then to receive further instruction described here as, and the law and the commandments which I have written so that you may teach them. The problem we really face is the katabti, that I have written. And that is because what has God written? And I think the best solution here is to see the luchot ha'ben, the tablets of stone, as that which God has written. And while it can be a difficult argument to make, or it just kind of has its difficulties, I think the eth, so the direct object marker, not the, I left off, as many Hebrews people say, it's just the direct object marker. I think it has here the perfect kal verb katabti, I have written, as referring to the luchot ha'ben, and it's singling out the tablets as the object of the verb. In the we conjunction heading hat Torah, the law, as signaling an aside, an additional thing. So that which Moses is to teach, which is the law and the commandment statutes, it's in the Hefil, which does support this reception of giving of something apart from what God has written and given. So we can punctuate this, or attempt to, as, I will give you the stone tablets and the law and the commandments that I have written so that you may teach them. So we have this kind of chiasm of sorts and a chiastic structure if we do retain the syntax to some degree. So I have written refers to the tablets, and the law and the commandments is this aside, which is the antecedent to so that you may teach them. And Childs here commenting on the baffling syntax is helpful. It supports us here as we do have a few reasons to speculate over what I'm proposing. The first would be that while God hasn't written anything except for the tablets themselves, and he hasn't, and didn't write anything else. Moses did. Moses wrote everything, and scribes after him. So Moses wrote the covenant code, so we don't have an antecedent for God's writing other than the Decalogue. The second thing that I would point out is that Israel has already heard the Decalogue. And for that matter, they've actually heard the covenant code too. So we shouldn't see this further instruction as being either of these. Instead, I propose that this is referring to the further instruction that we have in the Torah proper, that which is to follow, the whole law, the law as a whole. And this is very convincing because we actually have a parallel witness to my argument, and we find that in Deuteronomy 4:13 through 14. Yeah, 4:13 through 14. So, and then we'll read verse 12. I'm going to read that in the NET. Then the Lord spoke to you from the middle of the fire. You heard speech, but you could not see anything. Only a voice was heard. And then continuing in verses 13 through 14. And he revealed to you the covenant he has commanded you to keep, the 10 commandments, writing them on 2 stone tablets. Moreover, at that same time the Lord commanded me to teach you statutes and ordinances for you to keep in the land which you are about to enter and possess. So, the NET does a good job here at translating what's kind of obvious. So in the Hebrew, we're going to read for verse 13, Vayaged lakem eth berito asher siwa etkem laasot aseret hadebarim. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to keep, that is the 10 commandments. And then the Hebrew continues, Vayiktabem al sheneh luhot abanim. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. So, keep this in mind a little bit. Then in verse 14, we're going to read, Ve'oti tziwa yodhe wahe ba'eth hahi lelamed etkem. And we translate this, and Adonai commanded me at that time to teach you. And then it goes on to say, Hukim, Mishpatim, La'asotekim, Otam, so statutes and judgments so that you may observe them. So we have here God giving Moses, at the time of providing the covenant, the tablets of stone, that which Israel is to obey, we have him providing further instruction for the purpose of Israel observing when they cross into the land. So it's unambiguous with these 2 references that 1, the covenant is the Decalogue itself, and 2, that the Decalogue and the law are not the same thing, and therefore the covenant and the law are not the same. And then 3, that the law's primary and additional function is not only separate from the covenant material proper, but that its function is to provide instruction on how to live in the land. So, in other words, the law material is itself instructional and practical in nature, and it's not to be made synonymous with the covenant. And when we take this holistic approach to the text, it really yields to us this idea of the law not only being instructional, as it has been consistently portrayed as, textually, on both a macro, which we'll get to, and a micro, as we'll see as well, level. So it's just, you have to come to this conclusion with some type of theology in mind to be able to approach it. So what is the Decalogue the covenant? Well, Deuteronomy 4:13 seems to explicitly say that, but many have pushed back against this, and again, they're just very in their theological encampments. They're dogmatic entrenchments, I call it, that it's very impossible to even entertain this. But some scholars, actually, they bring up some good ideas. So one example we have is William H.C. Propp, and this is in his Anchor Yale Bible commentary. And I think this is volume 2. I think he has 2. He writes that the Decalogue is not the covenant. So pretty straight up. And he adds, the Decalogue is the symbol of the covenant, a text short enough to be engraved on 1 or 2 tablets and deposited in a chest. The true covenant lies in the details, elaborated with each level of redaction. So here he's saying, with each additional part that's being redacted, being edited. But he adds here too, at the far end, the process would yield to the beliefs that the covenant was subject to near infinite interpretation and elaboration, Judaism, or had been replaced by God, Christianity. End quote. So Propp dismisses the Decalogue as the covenant itself. He sees it more of a symbol. And he sees that the covenant itself could be any combination or amalgamation of ideas which are later extrapolated upon. And this is fair enough, as later writings, particularly Second Temple period Jewish ones, would start to see the covenant breaking it as much more than just breaking the Decalogue. Just breaking the ancestral ways would be seen as violating the covenant. But from the text, it would seem pretty clear that the covenant is at least the Decalogue, or that the Decalogue is at least a symbol of it. So kind of a maximal and minimal readings. And when we do look at the Decalogue, so the 10 words, the 10 commandments, we start to see how this really can make some beautiful sense. All right, I need a drink. So I've argued elsewhere that the Decalogue is symbolic of a relationship with God, and it isn't to be seen as commandments or prohibitions in the exact sense that we figure, but more so in this idea of principles, which expand well beyond their basic form. They're almost a starting point of concrete commands and prohibitions, but they're expansive in their application to all things, to both God and to other people. And we briefly touched on this in the Shema episodes. And I think there's a lot of truth with people splitting the Decalogue into two parts, one loving God and one loving man. I think there's a lot of validity to this, even if we should be careful to press this. So one scholar who actually kind of has the same ideas that I had, and I found his quote awesome, is Thomas Schreiner. And this is in his book, The King and His Beauty, where he's kind of going on about the heart and seeing how the Decalogue is ultimately about worship of God. And we'll quote him at some length. The only commandment that addresses the desires of the heart is the 10th, where the Lord prohibits coveting. The 1st and 10th commandments address the same issue. Whatever one covets or desires in one's heart represents what one worships. Nothing and no one should capture one's affections above the Lord. As Von Rad says, the intolerant claim for exclusive worship is something unique in the history of religion. The Lord must be first in one's passions and affections. This is back to Schreiner. Once we see that the 1st and 10th commandments address the same issue, it is clear that all the commandments fall under the same banner. Those who steal fail to trust the Lord for his provision and live as if they do not have a sovereign Lord who will supply all their needs. Those who do not honor their parents as an authority signify that they are rejecting the authority of the Lord over them, for God's will is to be communicated through parents. Those who murder view themselves as sovereign over life instead of entrusting both their lives and the lives of others to the will of God. So too, those who commit adultery are not satisfied to live with the wife or husband God has given them. They become their own lords and find their joy outside the will of God. Those who violate God's commands proclaim, like Adam, that they are independent and wise enough to determine what should be done. The 10 Commandments, then, reveal one's relationship with God, but they also set forth what it means to love other human beings, what it means to live in a human society. It is the charter for a right relationship with God and a right relationship with others. End quote. So Schreiner also adds here, he says that the 10 Commandments represent in strikingly declarative statements the will of God for Israel. Israel's obedience is not legalistic. Instead, Israel's obedience demonstrates that it's centered on God and worships him as the center of its life. End quote. And there's a lot we could add on here, particularly on Shabbat, of honoring God by setting apart a day a week of rest and worship, of giving up our own lives for serving him, of which our weeks oscillate around. And then also, especially of adultery being likened unto idolatry, which looks back like Shabbat, and resting from self and our will to the first commands. And we could elaborate upon Schreiner's words of stealing, being exerting autonomy, and murder too, and covetousness even, which is linked directly to idolatry by Paul and in other places. But Schreiner does a good job, in my mind at least, of showing how the Decalogue truly is this covenant principle charter for Israel. And when we look at it this way, it changes how we read it, not legalistically, but as these ideas of how one is to live before God and with him, and specifically in a society. And the covenant code actually follows in that same exact form. It's of applying primarily to how to basically function in any type of a society, so the core tenets, if you will, of how to live. And we might quote another scholar. So we'll quote Levi S. Baker, who we brought up just a little bit ago. And this is on the relationship of the Decalogue and the Covenant Code, where he quotes numerous people that we won't add to. But he writes, while scholars debate the origin and sources of the Covenant Code, less attention is paid to the relationship of the two blocks of material and the setting of the CC within the Sinai narrative. On the former, the CC remains a resumptive and expansive relationship with the 10 words. The 10 words are organizing principles, and the CC is the authoritative exposition that applies these principles to life in the land. On the latter question, the CC is presented as a literary unity and is located at a strategic point in the narrative after Yahweh's theophany and before the covenant's establishment, in order to offer a kind of theological rule for life in the presence of Yahweh. End quote. And Baker also offers that Exodus 24:3 is an allusion to the previous experiences of Exodus 21 or 20 verse 1 and 21 verse 1. So basically that Israel hears the 10 words, the Decalogue, and then goes and hears the covenant code, and therefore that now in 24 verse 12, Moses is going up to get the rest of the law, presumably in whole. So when we read the covenant code, as Baker and those he quotes see it, it is this expansive material on the principles that are outlined in the Decalogue, and the progressive revealing of God's instructions made obvious. He continually provides more and more instruction for a host of applicable and practical purposes, but the law as a whole, though distinct from both the Decalogue, the Covenant, and the adjoined Covenant Code, Exodus 21 to 23, the law is to be seen as this collection of instruction. And Baker is right to point out that the Covenant Code is hotly debated, but a very recent article actually has been written in JBL by Journal of Biblical Literature by Paul Hawking and Moshe Klein, and that's titled The Covenant Code, A New Way of Reading the Writing. And that's actually have it in 144.2, I believe. So that would be back in April. And they argue here, though, it's a really good article. They argue that the Covenant Code is involved in what they're calling literary weaving, which has primarily 5 threads focusing on outsiders, the disenfranchised, the authorities, including God, social order and legal system, and then finally national order and the calendar. And now Hawking and Klein's article, it's much too much to go over here, but the work is exceptional and particularly interesting as it comes down to source, form, and textual criticism stakes. And it adds to the textual nature of the Covenant Code alongside the rest of the Sinai event, and this promulgation of God's ways via the expanding revelation of the law. But at the end of the article, they write, as Joe Sprinkle says, these regulations as a whole are part of Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh's address to Israel and related to the narrative rather than simply being a collection of laws, and later, features more appropriate to literary art than law, end quote. And then they add themselves that the Covenant Code has a rich rhetorical purpose regarding the covenantal relationship of Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh with the people, end quote. So when looking at the secondary point, that is beyond the textual and structural analysis of their article, we can see that each of the sets of commands are directed to Israel concurrent with some type of obedient function to God in the context of what is found in the Covenant Code itself. So that we can say that the code is a type of principled expansion on the Decalogue, and it's extending further basic practices and requirements for Israel to function as a nation and as a society after God's heart, or at a minimum to reflect enough of His holiness to live before Him. And this is actually what a lot of the Torah is, living acceptably before and within God's presence. You're keeping the basic requirements of a right life and existence. And even with this comes a paradigm shift from meritorious obedience to coexistence with a holy God. And God is going to dwell in their midst in a land that must be devoted to Him. So its inhabitants must, if they are to live in his presence, act according to the right standard and co-inhabit the land, a microcosm or example of all of creation, within this holy standard, not like the nations that are being driven out for their perpetual sin. Torah is likened unto the fatherly instruction for his children who dwell in his home. And Israel, the land, is God's home. And then Israel, the people, are God's children. They must be obedient children to live with him. And now, for the human example, no person would think that a father's demand for his children to be obedient to him is legalism. But such an idea is actually encouraged, if not seen as fully required and justified to even enforce. So why is it different for God? Why is it different in his relationship with Israel? And why is legalism the answer to such a simple principle? The Torah is nothing more, and it sounds weird to say it, but it's nothing more than a holy God and a loving Father's perfect instruction for children. Children he desires to prosper and flourish in his midst. And God didn't become Father in the Second Temple period, or really in the Second Testament. And he didn't become Father then, wanting Christians to do well, whereas he was just Lord and King in the First Testament. And he's always been Father, and he's always wanted the best for his children, hence the Torah. And it's simple principles like this that need to guide our reading. But back to the expansiveness of the Torah at Sinai, it's helpful to see this structure of sorts before our eyes, of the law expanding outwards, being enlarged at all sides, as Israel's new relationship with God is concretized at the foot of this mountain. And of incredible importance here, when we're looking at the law, is looking at the literary elements of it, as it develops and expands as one would expect a story or a narrative to naturally unfold. So Israel, we're seeing Israel like developing children. We're seeing them continue on this journey of becoming God's people, and God consistently adds to the story new commandments, new instruction, but there's a very obvious order to it, and one which we could argue is holistically authentic, rather than the work of significant redaction, even from different authors like the documentary hypothesis asserts. And we mentioned very briefly earlier, the micro and macro textual nature of the law. And when we look at the structure of the books of the Torah, something develops. And here I think it's important that I mention that we haven't even gotten to the commandments of the law, but this is super important. We'll do that in the next episode. But as the commandments, it's important because they're intrinsically related to and they're interdependent of that which surrounds them. And we'll get to that, but it's critical we set up the nature and content of the law before getting into its details. So if we look at Exodus, we have the calling of Moses for God to save his people in Egypt, and the revelation of the burning bush, so God's manifest presence before Moshe. Then, until Exodus 12, the incident in Egypt of God destroying the bondage of the gods holding down Israel in Egypt. Exodus 13 through 18 then details Israel's exodus out of Egypt and onto Sinai. From 19 to 24, we have the revelation of God through Moshe to Israel. 24 to 31, the instructions of their tabernacle. And then 32 is the golden calf incident. 33 to 34, the reconciliation with God. And then 35 through 40, the construction itself of the tabernacle. And the very last verses of Exodus detail God's presence dwelling in and on the tabernacle. And this not only mirrors and kind of bookends the burning bush incident, but also the pillars during the Exodus travels. So chapter 40, verse 38 says that the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle during the day, and the fire was in it by night. So the main theme in Exodus, I would argue, is that God is instituting a relationship with Israel and creating this environment via the tabernacle to dwell with them. He has taken them from Egypt and he's brought them to his mountain, which is rich in symbolism. And he has now built a place to dwell with them. So the theme is creating presence with them. And then Leviticus begins with the priestly practices in the temple. In the tabernacle. So officiating the cultic relationship between God's presence in Israel And this is all the way till chapter 10. And so this is not some ambiguous and rough sketch of ceremonial commands, but it's a narrative of God creating a place to dwell, fostering a tangible relationship with Israel, providing for them a means of mediation between them. So he's establishing this relationship and establishing the holiness of sacred space into the tabernacle, which we'll be discussing that in the next episode. So not part 2, but the episode after that. Chapter 11 begins with the expanding outwardly notion of sacred space. And I say this frequently, that it's graded holiness. So we have the Holy of Holies, then we have the sacred space of the temple, then we have the sanctified area of the courtyard, and then the Holy Land of Israel. So Israel's holiness reflects the centrifugal expansiveness of God's holiness out of the temple and into the land. So Israel is expected to be holy and to create a holy land which is unprotected contra the temple, which is protected. So Leviticus 11 begins off the bat with dietary regulations. No pun intended there. And this immediately reflects the idea of the land being holy. And many, too, have pointed out the prohibited animals that called abominations to eat mirror that of the creation of the animal kingdom in Genesis. So Leviticus 11, 2 through 8 deal with land animals, 9 through 12 with sea creatures and fish, and 13 through 19 with the birds of the air. And in verses 20, it starts to move to wing insects. Then verse 24 switches to touch impurities, yitma. And I cover this all in Purity, Politics, and Parables for several pages. But each of these sections, the first 3 at least, comes with an inbuilt introduction. And this does mirror Genesis quite well, too. But it adds to the text a touch of intention. And if Leviticus is mirroring, it is at least categorically. So according to its categories, it is. But it's out of order. Some have used that as a big argument. But we'll probably discuss this in a different episode. But just a quick, well, we will, but just a quick glance quickly at the prohibited animals, one can recognize pretty easily that they all belong to either a predatorial or bottom feeder category. So any of the prohibited animals are going to be predators of land, sea, or air, or they're going to be essentially trash cans, like pigs, or environmental cleaners like shellfish, and the list goes on. So the dietary prohibitions, despite virtually every scholar ignoring this rather simple fact, reflects animals that are necessary and frequently, like subsequently, repulsive due to it. They're necessary for a certain function of the ecosystem to work, or they simply eat disgust. And it's almost superfluous for us to show the health reasons why these animals should not be eaten, particularly the fact that almost every virus known to man, including apparently COVID, via pangolin or pangolin, it's been spread by proximity, handling, or consumption of prohibited animals. Permitted, clean animals, on the other hand, they're either animals which can be domesticated or are domesticated, wild game, fish that's easily caught, etc. So, and somewhere in the middle is the most fascinating animal of the world, the chicken. And if you don't agree, I'm afraid you just don't know much about chickens. They are really one of the coolest animals. 3 things, that you have: broilers for meat, hens for eggs, and then you have roosters for fertilizing. So you have 3 different sub animals. I'm not going to get into it, but you get it. Anyway, Leviticus 11's prohibitions, therefore, they seem to most accurately reflect the course of nature. And these aren't taking shape as legalistic injunctions. And it's also worth pointing out that the distinction between clean and unclean animals did exist on Noah's Ark in Genesis 7. We have 2 pairs of clean and 2 pairs of unclean and 7 pairs of clean. And the difference is because the unclean weren't to be eaten or sacrificed. But, the first order in this section with Leviticus 11, it may also likely be due to just 2 practical possibilities. So the first would be food is a pretty important part of everyone's life, So what do you eat? And second, a good portion of the previous material has had to do with animal sacrifices in the tabernacle. So it's kind of like, all right, what about all these other animals? And in Leviticus 12, we then have another one of the more obvious parts of people's lives too, is childbirth. But that isn't really the gist here. In the next few chapters about purity aren't either. And we'll save that for another planned episode. But here, between chapters 11 and 15, we have here about the expanding sanctity of the tabernacle land. And this ends in chapter 16 and 17 with Yom Kippur and the sacrifices. And then we move into the so-called holiness code of chapters 18 to 20, which, if we can be purely honest here, this is the first thing that resembles any type of general legal and like a wholesome law or instruction thus far. Now, as we have argued, we shouldn't apply for the CC, for the covenant code. So here, we kind of have this first real section of law. But then chapter 21 switches back to priests, chapter 23 on the feasts, 24 on some aspects of the tabernacle, blasphemy, justice, 25 on the Sabbath and Jubilee years, 26 on blessings and punishments, and 27 on vows, harem land, tithes, and such. And that concludes Leviticus, which at this point hardly resembles a law. So Numbers is mostly a narrative book. And it's interesting how it progresses further. Instruction is just continuously added to the lot. But most of which, as we've said, they're really further elaborations on offerings and sacrifices, as well as purification practices, which, again, these are all related to the centrality of the tabernacle and fostering an environment for God to dwell with Israel. Thus, Numbers is somewhat a narrative expansion on what Leviticus has explained, and Leviticus itself is picked back up on where Exodus ended with the tabernacle. So just as Genesis ends and Exodus picks up in Egypt, it's all connected. And it's propelling the narrative forward into higher and higher degrees of Israel's deliverance out of Egypt and into God's arms. And a lot of scholars have written on this. But now we get to Deuteronomy, which, as the name itself denotes, is regarded as the second law. But the law nature of it, that is, prescribing commandments proper, doesn't actually happen until chapter 12. And then chapter 17 and on isn't law either. So really, you've got some 17 chapters of actual law. And up to this point, we've got about 30. So about 30 chapters of what we would expect the law to be. This 613 commandments law caricature that most believers characterize the Torah as. And now we have 30 chapters of 185 or so chapters, mind you. So the Torah, the first 5 books, it really doesn't take shape as a law as we think of it at all. And again, in my mind at least, this is really important. And this is important because even Messianics and Pronomians tend to fail to recognize this reality of how the Torah is given. It's fixed firmly and consistently and progressively unveiling narrative, and it's given to Israel throughout their continued experiences as they drew closer to God and God closer to them. And if certain commandments are given in that type of context, isn't it important to read it that way? So, the majority of the church misreads the law in this 613 enumerated codified law idea, which simply isn't. It's impossible, simply. 613 is a much later medieval idea. It's impossible to actually enumerate the commands given, much less the principles that many of them are. So how do you enumerate or evaluate loving your neighbor? And then we see even Paul uses farming commandments to mean ministers of the Gospels are to be paid. So it's not like we're merely appealing to any type of particular interpretive approach here. It's something that was established. But this idea of enumerating the mitzvot, it's just impossible. So this view is obviously incorrect. But equally so, Messianics tend to misunderstand how the commands are to be understood within their specific context, both their historical and cultural context, as well as their literary context. They almost gloss the law as indeed God's instruction, but then they read it in the exact same way Christians do, as these 613 rules that can just be almost like put into a book, a list, and la-di-da. And this isn't the only problem here. So the enumeration of 613, or being able to put the Torah into a list, but also what we have is the issue with the enumeration of 3, the categorizing of the Torah into, as most people are familiar with, the civic, ceremonial, and moral, or the civil, ritual, moral, etc. And this idea is simply impossible. Both really are, but so far we've briefly skimmed over the Torah, the Pentateuch, and this is the macro structure I'm talking about. Even though zooming in a bit more into the chapter structures are also still part of the macro. But if we start looking at the micro, we start to see the same pattern of nothing in the text suggesting any type of adequate structuring or formal categorizing that resembles law, as in what many do suggest the Torah is. And neither do we find any hint of this threefold category of civil, ritual, moral. In fact, these 3 tend to blend themselves so much that it seems for one to suggest that these categories exist, it just betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the law as a whole and of the commandments themselves. But what it really also does is it does not seem to actually look at how the Torah is structured and the nature of the literary flow and elements involved. Because the person reading the First Testament this way, they're not the way it is, the way it's written. They're not going to come to this formal, codified, legalistic idea unless they're influenced into that direction. If they were to categorize the law into parts, they'd probably end up with something more like temple commands, purity commands, then consumption commands, agricultural, economic, relational, and that's 6 there, I think. You could probably throw legal in there too, like, judicial, so 7. But even this isn't really sufficient at all, as these overlap constantly. It's also simply impossible to infer this idea or set of ideas directly from the text, the threefold division that is. And many people have railed against the idea. A lot of people always say something to the effect of, "Oh, we know this is just, fanciful." And one is a popular writer is Richard Averbeck, Old Testament scholar, and well, just the fact that in most critical works this categorization is never mentioned does seem to suggest that the idea just isn't convincing or popular enough to move beyond the layperson arena and into the critical and scholarly world. People just generally understand that the idea of civil, ritual, and moral is just anachronistic and a bit naive. So one person recently is Benjamin Szumski, and he has a brief and cogent page or 2 in his book Love and the Law, and that's part of Pronomian Publishing's Pronomian Pocket Guide series. And he writes, after following another author's example of the overlapping nature of the categories of commands in Scripture that we'll repeat for our own purposes in part 2, Szumski writes, "It is impossible to distinguish between ceremonial, civil, and moral laws, and even if it were to be maintained, the fact that no one in church history has sought to list every law beneath each label is a telling statement." End quote. So this last quote got me, and I trust his intellectual and authorial integrity here, as I have personally never seen somebody actually attempt to do this, and I'm willing to say because they really can't. And so in the accompanying footnote here, though, Szumski adds that he sees 3 types of law actually existing. One to all people at times, and a second to Levites, and then a third, which is essentially man-made commandments. And this is good, but I think a slightly better approach in my mind would be that there is the law of universal applicability. So that is the law as we understand it, God's instruction. And then we have the law specifically related to sacred space, which includes the sacrifices, all the various commandments there, and the list goes on. So we have the commands for dealing with nature itself, being the whole of the Torah, basically. And then we have the commands for dealing with God's coming into nature, for managing this, if you will. And this divides the law down to two separate parts, which can be easily divided after the coming of Christ. We have universal law and, let's say, particular relational law. That is the cult. And the text kind of seems to suggest this, but we get into some muddy waters when we are starting to ask, well, what do we do with the purity laws? And then what about the feasts and Shabbat and food? And I think we have plenty of solutions here in that impurity, and we'll definitely discuss this in another episode, but impurity is not a sin itself. And it was not something terribly avoided or taboo as much as we think it was, but is just a natural, normal consequence of life, of having a body, really. It's only a threat when it threatens to come into contact with God's presence. And again, we'll discuss this later. But another episode. But the idea here is that impurity is only something that has to really be managed in a context or in an environment where God's tangible and physical in some way presence is manifested. Is it unimportant then? No. Practical wisdom should still be drawn from this. An example is woman's bodily functions. And nature tells us that we shouldn't lay with our wives during menstruation. And nature demands that we don't for some weeks after having a baby. This is obvious. But what about a woman's period time after having a child? Being alone a week or two. And I remember when I asked my wife about this, about doing it, Nita, and she just responds like, a week alone with my newborn baby? Absolutely. Yeah, it really is quite a beautiful thing. Just leave mama alone with baby, let them totally and intimately connect, to sleep when they need to, and just bring them food. And there's a beautiful principle in that, just as there is with almost every aspect of the law. Enumerate that. You can't. But so impurity isn't an issue as it once was, but it still serves as instruction, as wisdom, and as insight into things that may not otherwise be as obvious, at least on the surface level. And now this demands a good bit of discussion. We'll do another episode on purity. But food and what we consume, certain animals, no blood, etc., has to do with nature and health. So we can only guess at the health implications for a lot of them concretely. But given that every single prohibited item in the Bible has been revealed to be of some type of toxicity or risk to human consumption, we can reasonably assume this is the case. Unclean animals didn't defile people when they ate it, so it's not part of the temple-related or sacred space-related realm. Shabbat is a creation ordinance or related to creation, so far beyond this idea, as are the feasts. And these are the main focuses for the discussion of ceremonial. And here alone we can recognize that while there is indeed a distinct element or aspect of these commands which pertain to the temple, they are ultimately a blended space of both the instituted worship of Israel's day and an eternal and continuous reflection of creation-ordered worship or proper functioning, albeit in a fallen world. So what do I mean? What do I mean here? I mean that one category of the law that we can pretty clearly and immediately discern is one we can almost call circumstantial worship, or perhaps better, temple commands. Regulations pertaining exclusively and temporarily to the temple governing God's presence. Sacrifices, Levitical procedures, the threats of impurity, and various details for the physical construction and maintenance of the temple ultimately have to do with creating a suitable space for God's presence to dwell physically, tangibly, and to some extent literally in our midst. Now in Christ, and this is way beyond what we're getting to here, these things have indeed changed, and significantly. So therefore, these commands are subject, even if temporarily, to certain changes. And these are actually the only true categorical commands of the law that are justifiably changed, altered, or even abrogated, etc., in light of Christ's coming. If we are to see Christ as fulfilling any aspect of the law, it is really and accurately that of the relational commands. And these are unambiguously so, those which had and have to do with God's presence among us. something the Spirit now fully affects in us. So the various and multiply commandments that have to do with regulating his presence, namely the temple-related commands. The rest of the Torah, however, have almost nothing to do with this. They're eternally and universally applicable so long as we live on this earth. As the rest of the Torah, even including many of the ritual commands, but not as much as people like to claim, has to do with how we are to interact with nature itself, properly, and society and people righteously. And this is where the idea of civil and moral comes into play. These categories people suggest. But this is a terribly difficult idea to uphold once you really think about it, is how exactly does one separate between moral, presumably including interrelationship interactions, and that of civil, societal relationships. So, let me put this in another way. Where does one draw the line between how we are to treat our neighbor and how civil commands regulate said relationships? Isn't the foundation of anything civil ultimately built on the moral? So isn't the civil or the judicial, isn't this idea of things just a systematized or systemized and enforceable program based upon the individual moral principles that we employ in our day-to-day and our personal interactions with people? I mean, in a sense, this is all civil commands really are. For example, are the various commands on debt and loaning and redeeming really civil? Or are they expressions of moral ideas like not defrauding, abusing, or taking advantage of your neighbor? Moreover, are certain aspects of loaning money not purely in the realm of moral, with unfair gain, creating uneasy and even detrimental situations for those lending from you, and then ultimately encroaching upon violating the apparently ceremonial aspects of the Sabbath and Jubilee years? And these are joined to the hip of the Sabbath and the festal calendrical system of Israel. So the rules on debt would presumably be placed under the civic or civil category, but they involve so much of the moral and ceremonial elements, it's just impossible. We can't reasonably suggest that they are, or that they even can be, separated from these other so-called categories. It's like one is just not possible without the other, or really without all of them involved simultaneously and in complement and explicative power to one another. And this is just this problem. It's just this consequence of reading them as codified statutes or reading them as legal injunctions rather than properly, as they seem to be, instruction from the God of Israel, an instruction which spreads as a set of principles all throughout and across its various perfected parts. That is, wherever the principle is forming a more tangible or material injunction like that of our odd example of debt. But we'll wrap this up for now, and we'll spend more time on in part 2 on the actual command, so we can start applying these things. For now, when we look at the Torah and how the literary construction of it is given to us, we are really seeing like the process of liminality for Israel as they progress deeper and closer into a relationship with God. And then he, as a father, reveals his truth and ways to them more and more. As they are immersed more into being his nation, his people, and really into being his children, the more he reveals to them of what he expects from them. He provides for them circumstantial instruction, and he continuously adds more and more concrete principles and commands as he cements himself in his presence in their midst. It is almost this moral rearing, this upbringing of Israel into the ideal people. And if we simply take a holistic and a rather natural reading of the Torah, the law, the legal material, and here what we have argued is instructive substance, it's so built into Israel's developmental history that it really is difficult to see the law as not being a fatherly instruction and creating an ideal and utopian existence that will look different if this all happened in the present day. But indeed, it really would. But it would still have the same principles. And And this is where we really need to try to reorient ourselves to the historical context of Israel's legal reception, while simultaneously we need to attempt to recontextualize the nature of law in its reception history. And this is what we'll return to in part 2 of this episode, or this topic. And namely, there we're going to look at A, viewing how the laws are related to or even dependent upon Israel's ancient Near Eastern neighbors. B, how the micro elements of the law work and what this connotes. That is how they're textually presented to us in groups and sections, and what we can draw from this. And then C, we're going to look at how the commandments work together within these various backgrounds. So, part 2, ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, the larger cultural backgrounds, and tie this into the ideas present and how we find the commands presented within the text. And this also will expand on where we're leaving off in this episode. We've covered the basic foundations of law, semantically and such, and some other details. But what we've really focused on here, what I've tried to, is we've tried to focus on the literary nature of the law. How it's progressively portrayed and given, and how this is important for us to understand how the law is to be understood, and therefore how it is to be interpreted, even in the present day. So that's our episode, mostly tracing the literary. Again, I want to just kind of introduce us into the law, move us into it, and just really try to figure out exactly how the law is set up, how it's laid out, and how it's written to us so that we can know how to read it. Written for our reading. And when we understand how it's written, we're going to better understand how to read it. But thank you, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode, and I hope everyone has a blessed one. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you, and may he be gracious unto you. May he give you his mercy. May he turn his face and his countenance towards you, and may he give you wonderful and unmistakable shalom. All right. Shalom, shalom, everyone. Shalom, everyone. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I pray the Lord uses it and blesses each and every one of you. The primary goal of the Shema Podcast is to provide sound and helpful teaching for Messianic believers everywhere, to feed the body of Messiah spiritual food. You can find my other research over at oliknos.com, where I blog and such regularly and write on topics apart from those that we discuss here. However, my focus is not just providing believers with the bread of the word, but also feeding the lost literal bread and more than that. Please consider checking out the ministry I run, the Shalom Truck. We are on Facebook and located in Central Georgia. The Shalom Truck is a mobile homeless outreach and food truck seeking to provide needed, kosher, and healthy meals for those in need in the area. We also operate pantry boxes scattered throughout the area where those in need can privately and anonymously get sundries, food items, and other things like sleeping bags, etc., whatever and whenever they need. Beyond this, we interact with and help people on a face-to-face level, and the goal is to provide them, most importantly, with the gospel of Christ. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, or you feel led to contribute to helping the homeless, please pray on and consider giving to the ministry in whatever capacity the Lord leads you. Thank you again for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one. Shalom, shalom.